The dog had already been sedated once that week. Not because he'd attacked anyone, though the report said he tried, but because no one at the facility knew what to do with a 110-pound Belgian Malinois who had stopped eating, stopped responding to commands, and had started throwing himself against the walls of his kennel at 3 a.m. with a kind of desperation that made the overnight staff call it a safety issue and reach for the tranquilizer before they reached for a solution. His name was Kodiak. He'd been with the 75th Ranger Regiment for 4 years. His handler, Sergeant First Class Daniel Donovan, had been found dead in his off-base apartment on a Tuesday morning in February, 11 days before Kodiak was transferred to the Lackland Kennels and listed as unplaceable. Unplaceable. That was the word in the file. Not dangerous, not aggressive. Unplaceable. Sergeant Major Gerald Marsh, the man who signed the transfer order, had written 2 sentences in the remarks section. Handler deceased. Dog shows signs of severe behavioral instability. Recommend evaluation for euthanasia if no improvement within 30 days. 30 days. That was what Kodiak had. When Fiona Slade arrived at the facility on a Wednesday afternoon in March, she had no idea any of this existed. She was 31 years old and had been a trauma nurse for 6 years, the last 2 of which she'd spent attached to a forward surgical team at a base in Djibouti that no one talked about at dinner parties. She'd come back to San Antonio 8 months ago with a deployment ribbon, a knee she'd twisted jumping off a transport, and a recurring dream about a patient whose name she still couldn't say out loud. She hadn't come to Lackland to help a dog. She'd come to drop off her friend's forgotten gym bag at the PX parking lot, and she'd taken a wrong turn. The kennel facility wasn't far from where she'd ended up. She could hear it before she could see it. That particular sound military working dogs make when something is wrong, not barking exactly, more like an argument between a howl and a scream. She'd followed the fence line, the way she always followed sounds she didn't understand, which was a habit she'd picked up somewhere between nursing school and her 3rd deployment and had never been able to put down. The airman at the gate looked at her like she'd grown a second head when she asked what was happening. "Training," he said. "That's not a training sound," she said. He blinked. She showed him her SAC card. He let her in, which in hindsight was probably a violation of at least 4 protocols, but Fiona had the kind of face that made junior enlisted personnel assume she outranked them even when she wasn't in uniform. She found Kodiak in the last kennel on the left side of the row. He was standing in the middle of the space, not pacing, not throwing himself at anything. Just standing. His head was low. His ears were flat against his skull. There was a scrape along his left shoulder that hadn't been properly cleaned, and his ribs were showing in a way that meant he'd been refusing food for longer than the file had admitted. The overnight sedation had worn off, and now he was simply there, motionless, in the particular way of an animal that has decided the world has nothing left to offer it. Fiona had seen that look before, not on a dog. She crouched down outside the kennel door. She didn't reach for the latch. She didn't make a sound immediately. She just got low and waited, the way she'd learned to do in the ICU when a patient was too fragile for the normal approach. After a while, she spoke. Not in English. In the command language that Sergeant First Class Daniel Donovan had used with Kodiak for 4 years. A mixture of Dutch and German that American special operations handlers sometimes trained in because it was less likely to be accidentally triggered by civilian conversation. Fiona knew it because she'd spent 14 months alongside a K-9 unit in her 2nd deployment, a handler named Torres who'd talked her through every command until she could use them herself, not because she needed to, but because Torres liked having someone to practice with during the long, slow nights between missions. She said quietly, the Dutch word for rest. Kodiak's head came up. She said it again. And then she added the German phrase that handlers used to signal a dog that his person was close, that everything was where it was supposed to be, that the work was done for now. The Malinois took 3 steps toward the kennel door and sat down. She hadn't touched the latch. She hadn't made any movement. She had just spoken the words in the sequence his nervous system recognized, and whatever had been coiled tight inside him for 11 days had shifted, slightly, the way a storm shifts when the pressure finally changes. The airman who'd followed her down the row said, softly, and with a kind of reverence that almost made her laugh, "What did you just say to him?" "I told him it was okay to stop," Fiona said. She came back the next day, and the day after that. She didn't ask for permission the first time. She told the kennel supervisor, a staff sergeant named Birch, that she was there to conduct a behavioral assessment, and Birch, who had 3 dogs in his care that the brass wanted resolved before the end of the month, decided not to ask too many questions. The third day, she brought food from her own kitchen. Chicken she'd slow-cooked in the same way Torres had taught her, plain, without seasoning, because working dogs respond to smell above almost everything else, and the processed kibble the facility used was something Kodiak had been ignoring for 2 weeks. He ate from her hand. Birch watched this from the other side of the fence, with his arms crossed, and his expression cycling through skepticism, confusion, and something that might have been relief. "He hasn't eaten since the first week," Birch said. "I know," Fiona said. "He's not refusing food. He's refusing everything that doesn't smell like his unit. Can you fix that?" "I can't replace his handler," she said. "But I can help him understand the handler isn't coming back." Birch was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like the same thing." "It's not," she said. "One of them is grief. The other one is limbo. Grief is survivable." She requested access to Donovan's file on a Friday afternoon, and that was when things got complicated. The request went up through Birch to the facility commander, a lieutenant colonel named Harwick, who reviewed it over a weekend and called Fiona into his office on Monday morning with the expression of someone who had spent the weekend being told contradictory things by different people. "Monsieur Slade," he said, and she noticed he'd checked her rank before she arrived, noticed the way his eyes moved to the discharge date on her personnel record. "You have medical clearance to work with the dogs here as a behavioral consultant. That's fine. What you're asking for now is a different thing. I'm asking for basic background on the deceased handler." "To help the dog," she said. "Donovan's case is active." That landed differently than she'd expected. She made sure her face didn't show it. "Active how?" Harwick looked at the wall behind her for a moment, in the way people do when they're deciding how much to say. "His death is under investigation. The file is restricted. By who? That's also restricted." She looked at him for a long moment. He was not an unkind man, she could see that. He was a careful one. There's a difference, and she'd learned to tell them apart. "The dog has 20 days left on his evaluation period," she said. "He's responding to me. He's eating. If I don't understand what Donovan was working on before he died, I can't help Kodiak transition to a new handler or a civilian placement. And if I can't do that, Kodiak gets euthanized. I'm not asking to review classified operational material. I'm asking about a man's life." Harwick said he would see what he could do. What he could do, it turned out, was send a 2-person team to her apartment the following morning. They weren't in uniform. One of them had the careful, neutral posture of federal law enforcement, and the other one was younger, quieter, watching the apartment the way people watch spaces when they're cataloging exits. They showed her credentials that confirmed they were with an office she'd never worked with directly, but had heard referenced in the margins of briefings. The older one, a woman with silver-streaked hair who introduced herself only as Agent Reyes, sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, "You've been visiting the Lackland facility 6 days in a row. You've been working with the Donovan dog. You've requested access to his file." "Yes," Fiona said. "Can you tell me why?" "Because he has 20 days before they euthanize him, and he's a good dog who's in grief." Reyes studied her. "How do you know the command language?" "I served with a canine unit for 14 months, and you just happened to end up at the kennel the day after Kodiak tried to bite through his containment wire." "I took a wrong turn," Fiona said. "I know how that sounds." Reyes looked at her for a long time. "Mrs. Slade, I'm going to ask you to stop visiting the facility." Fiona put her coffee cup down. "No." The younger agent looked up from the wall he'd been studying. "No?" Reyes said with the polished neutrality of someone who wasn't used to that answer. "That dog is scheduled to die because no one who has access to him speaks his language. I do. You can investigate whatever you're investigating, and I respect that, but Kodiak is not evidence. He's a living animal in acute psychological distress, and if I stop going, he dies. I would like you to explain to me what investigation requires that outcome." There was a silence in the kitchen that had texture to it. Reyes said, "You have no idea what Donovan was working on." "I know he's dead and his dog thinks he's coming back," Fiona said. "That's what I'm trying to solve." Another silence. Then Reyes said, "We're going to need to run a secondary clearance checking on you." "I'll wait," Fiona said. The clearance came through in 72 hours, which told her the investigation was moving faster than Reyes had implied. During those 72 hours, Birch quietly let her continue her visits and logged them as behavioral assessments, which was not technically inaccurate. On day 9, Kodiak let her put a leash on him. On day 11, she got him outside for the first time. She walked him to a patch of grass near the perimeter fence where the Texas sun came through at an angle in the late afternoon, and she sat down in the dirt without ceremony, and Kodiak stood next to her and raised his nose into the wind and held it there for a long time, breathing. She didn't say anything. She just let him have it. The sky, the sound of birds somewhere beyond the fence, the smell of the world outside. He was shaking slightly, the way dogs shake when they're not cold. She put her hand on his side between his ribs and his hip and felt the shaking slow. She thought about Torres, who'd told her once that the hardest thing about working with military dogs was not the training and not the danger. It was the fact that the dogs never understood why things ended. They just waited. They kept waiting. The waiting was the part that broke them. He doesn't know what happened, Torres had said. He just knows his person stopped coming. She'd thought about that a lot in the years since, more than she'd expected to. Reyes came back on the 14th day with her younger partner, and this time a third person, a man in civilian clothes who had the kind of stillness that came from fieldwork, not offices. He introduced himself as Specialist Anchor, which she suspected was not his real name or real rank, but that was fine. She'd worked with a lot of people who had occupational pseudonyms. They sat in the small consultation room off the main kennel building, and Reyes put a photograph on the table. It was a man she didn't recognize. Late 30s, broad-shouldered, photographed in profile at what looked like a veteran's bar. He was looking at someone off-camera with an expression that was careful and deliberate. "Do you know this man?" Reyes asked. "No," Fiona said. "His name is Vincent Okafor. We believe he's connected to Donovan's death." Fiona waited. Donovan was building a case, Reyes said. He'd been documenting the illegal resale of military equipment through a network operating out of 3 bases in the Southwest. He was killed before he could hand off what he'd collected, and Kodiak was with him when he died? Kodiak was locked in the bathroom of the apartment, Anchor said. It was the first thing he'd said since sitting down. Whoever did it either knew about the dog and contained him first, or knew enough about working dogs to understand he'd eventually stop fighting the door once the sedative wore off. Donovan was sedated. Donovan was sedated and then staged, Reyes quietly. It was set up to look like a cardiac event. His medical record showed a pre-existing condition. It nearly worked. Fiona looked at the photograph of Vincent Okafor. "What does this have to do with me visiting the kennel?" Okafor has accessed the Lackland facility twice in the past month. He has a legitimate contractor credential that we haven't been able to void without alerting him. We believe he's trying to determine whether anything Donovan gathered is stored with Kodiak's equipment. Reyes paused. Working dogs are sometimes used to carry items, in their vests, in their gear bags. Fiona thought about Kodiak's equipment, the tactical vest that had arrived with him from Donovan's unit, logged into the kennel inventory, sitting in a gear locker she'd walked past 6 times without looking at closely. "Has anyone searched the vest?" she asked. Reyes and Anchor looked at each other with the particular expression of people who have made an error they haven't admitted yet. "Birch inventoried it on arrival," Reyes said. Standard items according to someone who doesn't know what he's looking for," Fiona said. "I need to look at that vest." It was a data chip, about the size of a thumbnail, embedded in the lining of Kodiak's tactical vest behind a seam that had been restitched so carefully it had passed 2 standard inspections without anyone noticing. Fiona found it because she knew the vest. She'd handled enough gear in enough contexts to know the weight distribution was wrong, about 12 grams off, in a way that wouldn't register unless you'd carried that type of vest enough times to feel the difference in your hands. She handed it to Anchor without comment. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been in?" "I'm out," she said. 8 months. He said, in the way of someone filing information. The chip contained 15 months of documentation, purchase records, shipping manifests, photographs, communication logs. A careful, meticulous record built by a man who had understood he was doing something dangerous and had wanted to make sure it wasn't lost. Donovan had started building it 10 months before he died. He'd told no one. He'd hidden it with the only partner he trusted completely, in a place no one would think to look, precisely because it was so obvious. In the gear of a dog, with the teammate who'd never leave without him. Vincent Okafor was apprehended at the Bexar County line 6 days later, attempting to cross into Mexico with 3 others, 2 of whom had access to base facilities that now made the timeline of the equipment resales click into place. A 4th individual, a former logistics officer at Fort Cavazos, was arrested the following morning at his home in Killeen. Marsh, Sergeant Major Gerald Marsh, the man who'd signed Kodiak's euthanasia recommendation, was placed on administrative hold pending a full investigation. Whether he'd known about Donovan's case and tried to eliminate the evidence on 4 legs, or whether he'd simply processed a transfer order without understanding what he was signing away, was something the investigators were still untangling when Fiona last heard about it. She suspected she'd never get the full answer. That was the nature of cases like this. They had edges you couldn't find. The question of what happened to Kodiak next became, briefly, a complicated one. He wasn't eligible for standard adoption through the military working dog program. His behavioral history, the euthanasia recommendation, the association with an active case, all of it created paperwork that had paperwork behind it. There were meetings. There was bureaucracy. There was a period of approximately 3 weeks during which Fiona sat in waiting rooms and offices and made phone calls and did not raise her voice even once, which she considered a personal achievement. Reyes, to her credit, wrote a letter. Anchor, whose real name she still didn't know, sent documentation that classified Kodiak's behavioral improvement as significant and sufficient. Birch amended the evaluation report. A retired Army veterinarian in the Austin area signed off on a home assessment. On a Thursday morning in May, with more paperwork than she'd filled out for her own discharge, Fiona Slade walked Kodiak out of the Lackland facility on a leash. He stopped at the edge of the parking lot and raised his nose into the wind, the same way he'd done that first afternoon on the grass. The same deep, deliberate breath. She stood beside him and let him take his time. It was warm. The Texas spring was doing what Texas springs do, which is arrive suddenly and without apology, and the air smelled like cut grass and distant rain and something that was probably mesquite smoke from a neighborhood grill. Kodiak turned his head and looked at her. She said the German phrase, the one that meant the work was done, that his person was close, that everything was where it was supposed to be. She decided that was close enough to the truth. He walked to her car and waited at the back door with the patience of a dog who had learned, at great cost, what waiting looked like from the other side. She opened the door. He got in. 6 months later, Fiona began working with a program out of Joint Base San Antonio that connected trauma nurses with military working dogs in post-deployment transition, animals in exactly the kind of limbo Kodiak had been in, who needed someone who could speak the language and understood the particular silence that follows lost loss. The program was small and underfunded and ran mostly on volunteer hours and the goodwill of a few people who believed it mattered. She recruited Torres, who'd gotten out the previous year and was living in El Paso with his own retired MWD and too much free time. She found a handler in Fayetteville who'd kept detailed notes on command variations across 3 different working languages. She wrote a training manual that was 11 pages longer than anyone wanted it to be and absolutely necessary. The program didn't have a name yet, officially. Fiona called it Last Language in her head. Because that was what it was, the last language these dogs had, the one thing that still sounded like home when everything else had gone quiet. Kodiak came to every session. He didn't do anything in particular at these sessions. He sat near the entrance, or walked the perimeter of whatever space they were using, or found a patch of sun and occupied it with the profound contentment of an animal who has resolved a long argument with the universe and come to terms the universe found acceptable. Sometimes the dogs they were working with would notice him and settle, not because he did anything to calm them, but because he was proof of something, that the language didn't have to end when the person did, that there was another side to the waiting. Sometimes Fiona watched him from across the room and thought about what Sergeant First Class Daniel Donovan had known when he'd stitched that chip into the vest lining and sent his dog into an uncertain future with everything that mattered hidden somewhere no enemy would think to look. He'd known Kodiak would find someone who could hear him. He'd trusted the language to carry them both.